I had barely finished unpacking when I found my car missing. Not stolen, just gone, vanished into thin air like it had never existed. I spun around in my driveway, heart pounding, eyes darting up and down the street. That's when I saw her, arms crossed, smirking from her front porch, her signature clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. "Brenda, looking for something?" she called out, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. I clenched my jaw, forcing a calm breath. "Where's my car?" "Oh, you must not have read the email," she said, feigning innocence as she stepped closer. "HOA rule number 34, no street parking. Your car was towed this morning." The words hit like a punch to the gut. I had lived in my new home for less than a week, and already this woman had declared war. I had seen HOA horror stories online, but I never thought I'd be living one. "Are you serious?" My voice rose, disbelief taking over. "I didn't even get a warning." She smiled wider, eyes glinting. "Oh, you did. The email went out last night at 11:57 p.m. Rage boiled inside me. Who the hell sends a rule change notice in the middle of the night and enforces it the next morning? She had planned this. She wanted this. And from the way she stood there, enjoying every second of my frustration, I knew exactly what kind of person she was. I turned to look at my now empty curb, my stomach twisting in anger. Not only was my car gone, but I was also slapped with a fine of $200 for violating community standards. Brenda tilted her head. "Rules are rules. Maybe next time you'll pay closer attention." Then she turned on her heel and walked back inside, humming to herself. I stood there, fists clenched, watching her disappear into her house. My brain screamed at me to do something, anything, but there was nothing I could do. At least, not yet. That was the moment I decided I wasn't just going to get even. I was going to make sure she never forgot my name. The HOA had declared war. I was going to end it. The next few days were filled with phone calls, frustration, and a growing sense of helplessness. I paid the fine, retrieved my car from the impound lot, and tried to park it in my tiny driveway, only to realize that my truck barely fit. The HOA didn't allow street parking, but they also had strict garage conversion rules. I had no way out. I wasn't the only one suffering. My neighbors whispered about Brenda's reign of terror, how she fined people for leaving their trash cans out a minute too long or for having the wrong shade of beige on their fences. Nobody stood up to her, though. They were all afraid of getting targeted next. One evening, as I sat on my porch staring at Brenda's perfectly manicured lawn, an idea struck me like lightning. A slow grin crept onto my face. She wanted to play by the rules. Fine. I'd play by them too, but in my own way. The next morning, I made a few calls, browsed some rental listings, and by the afternoon, I had exactly what I needed, a 10-foot-long food truck. Brenda's biggest weapon was her ability to control the neighborhood's aesthetics. She hated anything that ruined the view. That's why she hated cars parked on the street. So what if I put something even bigger, even more annoying, right in front of her house? Something completely legal? I rented the food truck for a week, parked it directly in front of her driveway, and sat back with a cold drink to watch the fireworks. I didn't have to wait long. The moment Brenda stepped outside and saw the massive, brightly colored truck blocking her driveway, she let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a shriek. Her mouth flapped open and closed like a fish as she stormed across her lawn. "You have to move this," she barked, pointing at the truck like it had personally offended her. I took a slow sip of my drink. "Oh, I don't think so. See, according to the HOA rules, street parking is banned, but commercial vehicles aren't mentioned anywhere. This is a food truck, not a regular car, so I'm perfectly within my rights to park it here." Her face turned a deep shade of red. "This is an eyesore." I shrugged. "Rules are rules, Brenda." She stomped her foot like an angry toddler. "This is harassment." "Actually," I said, standing up, "harassment would be sending someone a rule change email at midnight and towing their car before sunrise. This is just parking." Her hands balled into fists. "I will have this removed. The HOA will hear about this." I grinned. "Oh, I'm counting on it." Brenda stormed off, her phone already in her hand, probably calling every HOA member she could think of. I leaned back against the truck, the satisfaction warming me more than the sun. This was just the beginning. By that afternoon, Brenda had called an emergency HOA meeting. The board members showed up in their golf carts, looking concerned. But when she ranted about my truck, they hesitated. "Well, technically, he's right," said Mr. Davies, the HOA president, rubbing the back of his neck. "The rules don't say anything about food trucks." Brenda's nostrils flared. "Then we changed the rules." One of the board members, an older woman named Diane, shifted uncomfortably. Brenda, we can't just change rules overnight. Then we do it tomorrow, she snapped. I stifled a laugh. She was so desperate, so enraged. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. The power she wielded over the HOA was slipping, and she knew it. That night, I made my next move. If she wanted a battle, I was going to give her a war. I called a few friends, got some permits, and by the next day, my little protest had turned into something bigger. I invited other food trucks. By noon, there were 3 more trucks lined up along the curb, selling everything from tacos to barbecue. Neighbors came out in droves, thrilled to have actual food options in the neighborhood. The air filled with the smell of sizzling meat and fresh coffee, laughter echoing down the street. Brenda stepped outside, and the look on her face was priceless. "This is an outrage," she shrieked. "You can't turn this into a carnival." I held up my phone. "Actually, I got permits from the city. They love the idea. Turns out there's no zoning issue with food trucks in residential areas." Who knew? Her scream was barely human. I had won the first battle, but I wasn't done yet, because the real war was just beginning. Brenda had always been a control freak, but I had never seen her this unhinged before. She stood on her porch, gripping her clipboard so hard that I half expected it to snap in half. Her face was the color of an overripe tomato as she stared at the growing line of food trucks in front of her house. The neighborhood had come alive in a way it never had before. People were outside, chatting, eating, and actually enjoying themselves, all while Brenda watched in horror. She stormed over to me, her footsteps heavy and deliberate, like she was marching into battle. "This is completely unacceptable," she spat, pointing an accusatory finger at the taco truck parked in front of her driveway. "You cannot just bring an army of grease-filled monstrosities into a peaceful neighborhood." I took a slow bite of my burger, savoring it before responding. "Actually, I can. The city approved the permits. The HOA rules don't prohibit food trucks, and the neighbors seem pretty happy about it." I gestured to a group of elderly residents happily munching on nachos at a fold-out table. Brenda's eye twitched. "You're disrupting the peace. This is a residential area." I let out a mock gasp. "Oh no, you're right. People are outside talking, eating, and having a good time. We must put a stop to this immediately." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" I shrugged. "Not really. Just good at reading the fine print." She inhaled sharply through her nose, trying to control herself. "Fine. Enjoy this little stunt while you can, because I'm shutting this down." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed back into her house. I had no doubt she was already on the phone, calling every HOA board member she could get a hold of. But that was the beauty of it. There was nothing she could do. Not yet, anyway. The neighborhood, on the other hand, was loving it. People who barely spoke to each other before were suddenly bonding over grilled cheese sandwiches and fresh coffee. Even the grumpy old man from 3 houses down, who usually just muttered complaints about teenagers and loud music, was sitting at a picnic bench devouring a plate of ribs like he hadn't eaten in years. The best part? Brenda's own husband had come outside, looked around at the food trucks, and casually ordered himself a burrito. I saw the exact moment Brenda spotted him standing there with a mouthful of carnitas, her face contorting in rage. He locked eyes with her, then slowly, carefully backed away into the crowd like he had just realized he was standing in enemy territory. By sunset, Brenda had sent at least 5 HOA emails, all filled with legal jargon and threats of immediate fines. I ignored them. The food trucks had full permits, and they had no reason to leave. In fact, the taco truck owner asked if he could come back the next weekend. Apparently, the sales were better here than in the usual downtown spot. That was when I knew I had struck gold. This wasn't just a one-time act of revenge anymore. This was a movement. The next morning, I woke up to find Brenda waiting for me on my front porch. She was standing there, clipboard in hand, an expression of forced politeness plastered onto her face. That was never a good sign. "Good morning, Mark," she said sweetly, and that alone sent a chill down my spine. "May I have a word?" I leaned against the door frame. "I don't know, Brenda. Is this a conversation, or are you just going to scream at me again?" Her jaw tightened. "I have spoken with the HOA board, and we are implementing a new rule, effective immediately. Commercial vehicles may not park on residential streets for more than 30 minutes. I whistled low. "Wow, that was fast. You really must have spent all night working on that." She ignored my comment. "This means your food trucks will have to leave. If they do not, I will personally see to it that every single vendor is fined." I rubbed my chin, pretending to think it over. "That's an interesting rule, Brenda. but I think there's a small problem. Her eyes narrowed. What? You can't enforce a rule retroactively. The trucks are here under the rules that were in place before your sudden change. They're grandfathered in. Her mouth opened and closed as she processed that. Then, in a move I had been waiting for, she snapped. Her fake calm demeanor shattered like glass. You cannot do this, she shrieked, completely losing whatever self-control she had left. This is my neighborhood. I run this HOA. You think you're clever? You're nothing but a smug little. A voice interrupted her mid-rant. Brenda, that's enough. We both turned to see Mr. Davies, the HOA president, standing a few feet away. He looked tired, like he had been dealing with far too many Brenda-related problems in the last 24 hours. Brenda immediately switched gears, turning to him with an exaggerated sigh. Oh, thank goodness you're here, Thomas. You have to put a stop to this circus. Mr. Davies crossed his arms. I read through the new amendment you rushed through last night. It's legally flimsy at best, and Mark is right. The trucks were here before the rule change. We can't fine them for something that wasn't a violation at the time. Brenda's face twisted in shock. Are you taking his side? He sighed. I'm taking the side of what's enforceable. And let's be honest, Brenda, the food trucks are not the worst thing that's ever happened to this neighborhood. Brenda looked like she was about to explode. She took a deep breath, nostrils flaring, and then turned back to me with pure venom in her gaze. This isn't over. I smirked. I'd be disappointed if it was. She stormed off, practically vibrating with rage. Mr. Davies lingered for a moment, then gave me a tired nod. I don't like getting dragged into this kind of drama, but between you and me, this whole thing has been hilarious. I grinned. I'll make sure you get free tacos next time. He chuckled and walked away. That night, as I sat outside watching the neighborhood enjoy another round of food truck festivities, I thought about what Brenda's next move would be. She wouldn't stop now. If anything, this loss would make her more desperate. But that was fine, because I wasn't going anywhere, and neither were the food trucks. Brenda was quiet for 2 days. That should have worried me, but honestly, I was too busy enjoying my victory. The food trucks had become a neighborhood staple almost overnight. People who had never spoken before were now gathering outside every evening, chatting over tacos and burgers like they had been best friends for years. Even the most antisocial residents couldn't resist the smell of fresh barbecue. It was everything an HOA was supposed to hate: fun, community-driven, and completely beyond their control. But I knew Brenda wasn't the type to accept defeat. She wasn't just licking her wounds. She was plotting. I could feel it in the air, like the calm before a storm. That storm arrived on the morning of the third day in the form of a letter. Not just one, but dozens. Every single house in the neighborhood had received one, slipped under doors, taped to mailboxes, or stuffed into decorative garden fences. Brenda hadn't just written them. She had delivered them personally. I picked mine up and read it while sipping my morning coffee. Dear homeowners, it has come to the HOA's attention that the recent influx of commercial activity in our neighborhood has created an unsanitary, disruptive, and unsafe environment for residents. In light of these concerns, an emergency HOA meeting has been scheduled for tomorrow evening, where we will vote on an immediate and permanent ban on all unauthorized business activity within the community. Your attendance is strongly encouraged. Sincerely, Brenda D. Wallace, HOA Compliance Director. I let out a slow whistle. So that was her plan. If she couldn't get rid of the food trucks with the existing rules, she would just change them again. And this time, she wasn't playing defense. She was rallying the troops. The problem was, Brenda had spent years building her HOA empire. Most of the board members were either terrified of her or completely indifferent. The people who actually liked the food trucks didn't usually show up to meetings. That's why she was calling a vote now. She thought no one would fight back. She was wrong. That evening, I made my rounds. I knocked on doors, talked to neighbors, and laid everything out for them. I told them exactly what Brenda was trying to do and what it would mean if she succeeded. The response was overwhelming. People weren't just annoyed by Brenda's antics anymore. They were furious. She had ruled over the neighborhood like a dictator for years, and for the first time, they had a reason to push back. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around, Brenda must have known something was off. The usual meetings were held in the community clubhouse and attended by the same 6 or 7 people who had nothing better to do. This time, the room was packed. People were standing against the walls, whispering to each other, casting Brenda dirty looks. She stood at the front of the room, her clipboard in hand, trying to keep her usual smug expression, but there was tension in her posture. She knew she wasn't in control anymore. The meeting started like all HOA meetings do, with mind-numbing bureaucratic nonsense. Brenda droned on about property values, community standards, and the importance of maintaining a pleasant aesthetic. But then she got to the part that actually mattered. In light of the recent disruptions, she said, emphasizing the word as if we were talking about a violent protest instead of some people enjoying food trucks, the HOA board has proposed an amendment to our community guidelines. This amendment will prohibit any and all unauthorized commercial activity within our neighborhood, ensuring that our streets remain peaceful and free from congestion. There were murmurs of discontent, but Brenda continued, acting as if no one's opinion mattered. This proposal will be put to a vote tonight. Only registered HOA members may participate, as per our bylaws. She was trying to cut people out of the decision. The problem was, she had underestimated just how many of us had taken the time to become voting members after her last stunt. One of the board members, a frail-looking man named Alan, cleared his throat. Before we proceed, I think it's fair to let the community express their thoughts. Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't want to, but she had no choice. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. If anyone has a statement, keep it brief. That was all the invitation I needed. I stood up and turned to face the room. Brenda claims the food trucks are disruptive, I said, letting my voice carry. But what's really disruptive is how she changes the rules whenever it suits her. We all saw what happened last week. She sent out a rule change email in the middle of the night and had my car towed before I even woke up. Then, when I followed the rules and brought in a food truck, she scrambled to change them again. This isn't about keeping the neighborhood peaceful. This is about control. A few people clapped. Brenda's eyes flashed with anger, but she stayed silent. I turned to the rest of the room. How many of you have been fined for things you didn't even know were violations? How many of you have had your yards, porches, or cars nitpicked by Brenda personally? How many of you have wanted to fight back, but didn't because you thought you were alone? Now the room was buzzing. People were nodding, whispering, agreeing. Brenda's grip on her clipboard tightened. I gestured toward the window. The food trucks brought something we haven't had in years: community. People are talking to each other again. We're actually enjoying our neighborhood, instead of living in fear of another HOA email. Brenda's voice cut through the noise. This is not a democracy, she snapped. The HOA exists to uphold the rules, not cater to every whim. But the rules are supposed to be fair, someone interrupted. It was Mrs. Evans, a quiet woman who had lived here for over 20 years. But they're not. Not when you're the one deciding them. A few more voices chimed in. She changed my fence color without approval, but fined me when I painted it back. She threatened to fine my teenage son for playing basketball in our own driveway. She had my Christmas lights removed because she didn't like them. The crowd was turning. Brenda was losing. She slammed her clipboard down. This is ridiculous. We are here to vote, not to air petty grievances. Alan cleared his throat again. Actually, Brenda, I think it's important that people feel heard. Her face went pale. She knew what was happening. We took the vote. It wasn't even close. The majority rejected Brenda's new rule, leaving her standing there, completely defeated. The moment the results were announced, a slow clap started in the back of the room. It grew, spreading throughout the crowd until the entire room was applauding. People were laughing, shaking hands, even hugging. Brenda, meanwhile, grabbed her clipboard and stormed out of the meeting, her heels clicking against the tile floor like gunshots. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. But neither was I. Brenda disappeared for a few days after the disastrous HOA meeting, but I knew better than to think she had given up. She wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. If anything, her silence meant she was planning something bigger, something worse. I had embarrassed her in front of the entire neighborhood, stripped away the control she had worked so hard to maintain, and worst of all, I had done it by using her own rules against her. There was no way she was letting that slide. The first sign of her next move came in the form of complaints. Not just one or two, but a flood of them. The HOA had a system where homeowners could submit anonymous grievances, and overnight, I had become the most complained about resident in the entire neighborhood. They were absurd accusations, things like excessive noise, improper lawn maintenance, and even disturbing the peace. Someone had reported me for unauthorized gatherings, which, as far as I could tell, meant having a normal conversation with my neighbors outside. I wasn't the only one targeted. The food truck vendors started receiving sudden visits from health inspectors and parking enforcement officers. Some of them were slapped with fines for minor infractions that had never been an issue before. A few were even told that their permits were under review, which conveniently meant they had to stop operating until further notice. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. Brenda couldn't win in a fair vote, so she was trying to drown us in red tape. At first, I thought I could ignore it. I figured the complaints would be dismissed as nonsense, that the food trucks would sort out their paperwork, and everything would go back to normal. But Brenda had connections. She knew exactly who to call to make life miserable, and within a week, things had escalated beyond what I had expected. The HOA sent an official notice stating that I was now under probationary review for multiple violations. If I received 3 more citations, I would be subject to a formal hearing that could lead to serious fines or even eviction. I had never even heard of this process before, but after digging through the HOA's ridiculous bylaws, I realized why. It was an obscure rule, buried in a section no one ever bothered to read, a rule that only applied in extreme cases of noncompliance. Brenda had somehow twisted it to paint me as a repeat offender, even though all the complaints against me were completely bogus. I had to admit, it was a smart move, underhanded and petty, but smart. I wasn't going to sit back and let it happen. The first thing I did was gather evidence. I went through every single complaint, documented how absurd they were, and took pictures of my property to prove that none of the so-called violations existed. I even got statements from my neighbors confirming that Brenda was fabricating the entire thing. But I knew that wouldn't be enough. Brenda had spent years manipulating the HOA's system to work in her favor, and I needed something bigger to fight back. That's when I started digging into Brenda herself. It turned out Brenda wasn't as squeaky clean as she pretended to be. She loved enforcing HOA rules on everyone else, but she had a long history of conveniently ignoring them when it suited her. Her backyard had an unapproved shed. Her fence was technically 2 inches taller than regulations allowed, and she had built a custom patio without getting the necessary permits. None of this had ever been a problem because she had been the one controlling what was enforced and what wasn't. That wasn't even the worst part. After some deeper digging, I found something even better. Brenda had been quietly funneling HOA funds into administrative expenses that didn't seem to have any real purpose. Over the years, she had approved thousands of dollars in unexplained charges, all of them conveniently vague. Nobody had ever questioned it because she always framed it as necessary maintenance or operational costs. But now that she was under scrutiny, it wasn't hard to see the pattern. She had been using HOA money for her own personal expenses. I knew I had to be careful with this information. If I came out swinging too early, Brenda would find a way to cover her tracks. I needed to wait for the right moment to strike. That moment came when the HOA scheduled my formal hearing. Brenda must have thought she had me backed into a corner. She had arranged for a full review of my violations, making sure it was an official process. She wanted to make an example out of me, to show the neighborhood that even after her embarrassing defeat at the meeting, she was still in control. The hearing was held in the community center, the same place where I had beaten her the first time. This time, though, the atmosphere was different. There was no cheering crowd, no sense of excitement, just a long table where the HOA board sat with Brenda at the center, her smug smile firmly back in place. I sat across from them, keeping my expression neutral as she read through the list of accusations against me. I let her talk, let her pile on the nonsense, let her feel like she had already won. She was practically glowing with confidence by the time she finished. Then it was my turn. I started with the basics. I presented my evidence, the photos, the neighbor statements, everything proving that the complaints were baseless. The board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing they had been pulled into something petty. A few even exchanged uneasy glances. But Brenda still looked confident. She had already anticipated this. She was waiting for me to finish so she could shut me down with some technicality. That's when I pulled out my real weapon. I placed a thick stack of documents on the table and slid them toward the board members. While I was reviewing the HOA's bylaws, I stumbled across some financial records. Turns out there are a lot of questionable transactions listed under administrative expenses. Brenda's smile vanished. I continued, my voice calm but firm. Thousands of dollars in unexplained charges, all approved without proper documentation. I cross-referenced the dates, and interestingly, some of these expenses coincide with the installation of a new patio in one particular backyard. Brenda shot up from her chair. That's ridiculous. You have no proof. I leaned back. Oh, I have plenty. Receipts, timestamps, even a few contractor invoices that somehow got mixed in with HOA paperwork. And I'm more than happy to bring this to the city's housing department for a full investigation. The room was dead silent. One of the board members, a man named David, cleared his throat. Brenda, is this true? Brenda was shaking with rage. This is an invasion of privacy. He's making baseless accusations. I think we need to take this seriously, David interrupted. If there's financial misconduct, we can't just ignore it. The other board members murmured in agreement. I smiled. And since we're talking about rule violations, I also have some photos of an unapproved shed, a non-compliant fence, and a patio that seems to be missing the proper permits, all of which belong to Brenda. Brenda turned to the board, desperate. You're really going to listen to him? After everything I've done for this neighborhood? David sighed. Brenda, I think it's time for you to step down. It was over. She knew it. I knew it. The entire board knew it. Brenda stormed out of the room, her face red with fury. The neighborhood had officially been freed from her rule. But I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Brenda didn't take her downfall gracefully. The moment she stormed out of that meeting, I knew she wasn't going to simply disappear. People like her didn't just admit defeat and move on. No, she was the kind of person who had spent years manipulating and controlling everything around her. And now that her power was slipping through her fingers, she was going to come back even harder. The only question was how. The answer came the very next morning in the form of flashing red and blue lights parked outside my house. I was sipping my coffee on the porch when two uniformed officers stepped out of their cruiser and made their way up my driveway. For a split second, my mind raced through every possibility. Had Brenda actually found a way to press some ridiculous charge against me? Had she convinced the HOA to take some kind of legal action? But when the officers finally spoke, I almost laughed out loud. Sir, we received a report of an abandoned vehicle on this property, one of them said, glancing at my truck. I raised an eyebrow. You mean my truck? The one I own? The one that's literally parked in my driveway. The second officer pulled out a small notepad, flipping through it. The report states that a derelict vehicle has been left here for several days, violating community ordinances. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. Of course, Brenda had gone full nuclear and called the cops on my food truck, trying to frame it as some kind of abandoned junk heap. The sheer pettiness of it was almost impressive. I gestured toward the truck. It's not abandoned. It's fully functional, licensed, and insured. You want me to start it up for you? The first officer glanced at his partner, then back at me. That won't be necessary, sir. It's clear this was a false report. I could see the flicker of irritation in their expressions. They knew they had been sent on a wild goose chase, and nobody likes having their time wasted. One of the officers turned around just in time to see a curtain shift in Brenda's window. She was watching, waiting, hoping to see me get dragged away in handcuffs over a parked truck. Instead, all she got was a pair of unimpressed cops walking back to their car. As they left, I flashed her the biggest, most smug grin I could muster. That should have been the end of it. But Brenda wasn't just throwing one last tantrum. She was launching an all-out war. By the end of the day, I had received 2 more visits. One from a city zoning officer, who informed me that an anonymous complaint had been filed about illegal commercial activity being run from my property, and another from a health inspector, who had been told that my food truck was a biohazard that needed to be investigated. Both visits ended the same way. The officials showed up, checked everything, and found absolutely nothing wrong. They left annoyed but ultimately unconcerned. Brenda, on the other hand, was getting increasingly desperate. She made her next move later that evening. I was relaxing on my porch when I noticed a familiar figure sneaking across my front yard. It was Brenda, her phone clutched in her hand, snapping pictures of my truck like she was gathering evidence for some major crime scene. I let her take a few more, just to let her think she was being sneaky, before I cleared my throat loudly. She jumped, spinning around, clutching her chest like I had just caught her breaking into my house. Brenda, I said, drawing out her name. What exactly are you doing? She straightened her spine, smoothing down her sweater like she hadn't just been lurking around my property, just documenting violations for the HOA records. I crossed my arms. Brenda, you're not on the HOA board anymore. Her face twitched at the reminder. That doesn't mean I can't ensure that this neighborhood stays in line. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Brenda, you called the cops, the zoning office, and the health department. They all came. They all left. They all told you to stop wasting their time. Maybe take the hint. Her eyes narrowed. You think you've won, don't you? I smirked. I don't think it. I know it. That was the final push. Brenda snapped. Her face twisted in rage, and before I could react, she grabbed her phone and bolted back toward her house. I assumed she was just going to send another round of angry emails, but I had underestimated just how far she was willing to go. The next morning, I woke up to find Brenda's car parked directly behind my food truck, blocking it in. She had wedged it so close that I wouldn't have been able to move it even if I wanted to. It was an outright blockade. I stood there for a moment, staring at the sheer insanity of it. Then I laughed. Brenda, of course, came marching out of her house the second she saw me looking. "Looks like you have a parking problem," she said smugly. I tilted my head. "You really think this is going to work?" She crossed her arms. "I'm simply following the rules. I'm allowed to park on my own property, aren't I?" I gave her a slow nod. "Sure. And you know what? So am I." That was all I needed to say. I pulled out my phone, made a few calls, and within an hour, another food truck arrived. And then another. And another. Before long, the entire street was lined with them, creating a massive blockade that effectively boxed Brenda in from all sides. She came outside again, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You can't do this." I grinned. "Why not? We all parked legally, just like you." She stomped her foot. "I'll call the HOA." I shrugged. "You mean the same HOA that just kicked you out?" Her face turned redder than I'd ever seen it. She stormed back inside, probably to call the cops again. But this time, she had no argument, no fake violations, no legal loopholes. She had just parked her car in the worst possible place, and now she was trapped in her own petty revenge. The best part? The food trucks had become so popular that they had started drawing attention from local news outlets. A reporter had heard about our neighborhood food festival and had stopped by to cover it. The segment aired that night, featuring smiling families, happy vendors, and one small, but incredibly satisfying shot of Brenda peeking out from behind her curtains, realizing she had lost. By the time she finally moved her car the next morning, the damage was already done. The entire neighborhood had seen her tantrum for what it was. The HOA was done with her, the city was done with her, and most importantly, the neighbors were done with her. Brenda had spent years ruling this neighborhood like a tyrant, but now, for the first time ever, she had no power. And judging by the way she avoided eye contact as she pulled out of her driveway, I knew she finally understood it. The war was over, and I had won. Brenda's defeat should have been the end of it, but people like her don't just fade away quietly. Even after everything, the failed HOA rule changes, the police calls, the city complaints, and the food truck fiasco, she still couldn't let it go. The difference now was that she didn't have the power she used to. She had no authority, no influence, and most importantly, no one left on her side. That didn't stop her from trying, though. For the next few days, she sulked around the neighborhood, watching everything unfold like a ghost haunting the very streets she once controlled. Every time I saw her, she had that look on her face, the one that said she was trying to think of a way to take back control. But no matter how many times she scowled at the food trucks or tried to intimidate the neighbors with her clipboard-free presence, nobody cared anymore. The reign of Brenda was officially over. The food trucks continued to thrive. What had started as a petty act of revenge had turned into something bigger than I ever expected. People actually looked forward to the weekend lineup of different cuisines, and some of the vendors even started offering discounts to regulars. It was no longer just a way to mess with Brenda. It had become something the entire neighborhood enjoyed. The best part? With Brenda gone from the HOA, nobody was there to try and shut it down. One afternoon, I saw her standing on her porch, arms crossed, glaring at the lively scene unfolding on our once quiet street. It was a warm Saturday, and families were out enjoying themselves. Kids laughing, neighbors mingling, people eating at picnic tables that had mysteriously started appearing along the sidewalk. The sense of community was stronger than it had ever been, and I could tell it was killing her. That's when the for sale sign appeared in front of her house. I wasn't sure if she had been planning to move for a while or if this was a spur-of-the-moment decision fueled by sheer embarrassment, but either way, the sight of it nearly made me burst out laughing. The woman who had spent years dictating every little thing about this neighborhood was now running away from it. The irony was too good to ignore. Word spread fast, and by the end of the day, practically everyone in the neighborhood knew that Brenda was selling her house. Some people pretended to be sad about it, but most were just excited at the thought of finally being free of her presence. There were whispered jokes about throwing a block party the second she left, and I wouldn't have been surprised if someone was already planning a celebration. Brenda, of course, acted like she didn't notice any of it. She carried herself with the same air of superiority, as if she was choosing to leave on her own terms and not because she had lost everything. But every now and then, I would catch her looking out at the neighborhood, watching people enjoy themselves in a way they never had before, and I knew she felt it. The world had moved on without her. Her house sat on the market for weeks. Turns out, people weren't exactly lining up to buy property in a neighborhood that had been all over the internet thanks to the viral video of her meltdown. Anyone who looked up the address would immediately find articles, local news stories, and a collection of memes featuring her angriest moments. Even real estate agents seemed hesitant to show the place. I don't know if she realized that or if she was just stubborn, but she refused to lower the price. It was overpriced to begin with, but Brenda was the kind of person who would rather sit on an empty house for years than admit she had made a mistake. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood only got better. The HOA, now free from her iron grip, actually started working the way it was supposed to. The ridiculous rules she had enforced for years were quietly rolled back, replaced with fair policies that actually made sense. People started making improvements to their homes without fear of receiving a fine for something as ridiculous as a flower pot in the wrong shade of blue. The difference was night and day. I figured Brenda would eventually sell the house and disappear, but she had one last meltdown left in her. One evening, I was sitting outside enjoying a fresh cup of coffee from one of the food trucks when I heard yelling. It wasn't the usual frustrated grumbling of someone upset about a parking spot or a dog barking too loudly. This was full-on, furious shouting. Curious, I got up and followed the noise, along with half the neighborhood. The sight that greeted us was nothing short of spectacular. Brenda was standing in her driveway, screaming at a potential buyer. A young couple stood there looking equal parts horrified and amused as Brenda waved her arms wildly, ranting about entitled homeowners and disrespectful neighbors. The real estate agent standing off to the side looked like she was seconds away from quitting her job entirely. I caught bits and pieces of Brenda's tirade as I approached, something about how the neighborhood had gone downhill ever since she lost her position, how it was now unlivable, how the HOA had turned into a lawless free-for-all. The couple just nodded along, clearly only sticking around for the free entertainment. They weren't buying anything from her. That much was obvious. Eventually, Brenda noticed the growing crowd of neighbors watching her meltdown. Her face turned a deep shade of red, and she let out a frustrated screech before storming inside her house and slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed lasted all of 5 seconds before someone started laughing. Then another person. Then the entire crowd. It was the perfect ending to the saga. Brenda finally sold her house a month later. Nobody knew exactly how much she ended up settling for, but rumor had it she had to lower the price significantly just to get anyone to bite. When the moving truck arrived, people gathered to watch, some not so subtly celebrating as they saw her belongings being packed away. I didn't say anything to her as she left. I didn't need to. The victory was already mine. As her car pulled out of the driveway for the last time, I couldn't help but call out, "Hey, Brenda." She looked at me through the window, scowling, waiting for whatever parting words I had for her. I grinned. "Looks like there's no parking for you either." Her tires screeched as she sped off. The neighborhood threw a party that weekend. Not an official one, of course, but more of an unspoken celebration. People set up tables outside. The food trucks stayed open late, and music played from someone's backyard speakers. The sense of relief in the air was almost tangible. The HOA, now under new leadership, actually worked for the community instead of against it. The absurd fines disappeared, the ridiculous restrictions were lifted, and people finally felt comfortable living in their own homes again. The neighborhood flourished, all because someone had finally stood up to the tyrant who had ruled it for far too long. As I sat there, eating a fresh taco and watching the street come alive with laughter and conversation, I realized something. I hadn't just beaten Brenda. I had changed the neighborhood for the better. And that, more than anything, was the real victory.